you know that a surprising number of objects that you use every day are thanks to accidents? Let me show you what I mean. In this episode, we discover how a broken thermometer leads to revolution.
Something very interesting started to happen.
Find out how a failed experiment gives rise to the world's greatest crime-fighting tool.
So something that was totally an accident ended up impacting every single one of our lives.
And learn how a cut finger leads to the age of plastics.
He has discovered, through a series of accidents, a new material.
Oops, I changed the world. There aren't many items of clothing you can wear, whether you're a rock star, a construction worker, a cowboy, a pianist, supermodel, a toddler, or in your 80s. But the chances are you have a pair of blue jeans.
Got about 5 to 6 jeans in my wardrobe. 3 at any time.
Maybe 10 pairs of jeans? I have day jeans, evening jeans, black jeans, blue jeans. Jeans for all occasions.
Given how popular they are, it's perhaps no surprise that the worldwide value of the jeans market today is over $110 billion.
I can't really imagine how much that is.
That's either one Jeff Bezos or Morocco's entire GDP.
Ah, thanks. But there was once a time when blue clothing was a rare sight.
Historically, dyes are made from natural products. Plants, shells, bugs.
Kola wood, which has a rich, warm brown tone.
Even foods.
Blue clothes were dyed with a pigment known as indigo from the plant Indigofera.
In the ancient times of the Roman Empire, it was actually traded along the Silk Road, and it was right up there with silk and gold in its value. In fact, people actually called it blue gold.
Indigo was so expensive that it was only worn by aristocrats or royalty.
Most people were wearing browns and greens, very earthy colours. So to be parading around in blue was a really obvious sign of wealth and of power.
The reason why indigo is so expensive is because it comes from hot climates like in India.
In fact, the name indigo comes from the ancient Greek for Indian.
It's also very labor intensive. You need 200 pounds of leaves just to make 1 pound of dye.
The leaves are covered in water and left to ferment into a muddy green pulp, which contains a substance called indoxyl. But it's not until oxygen gets into the mix that the colour blue develops.
Here they are trying something now that seems to do the trick.
The mixture is stirred, and that introduces air. The oxygen in the air causes the indoxyl molecules to combine together, and they precipitate out as a solid and settle on the bottom. And once it's all done, it can be brought together and formed into a brick.
Given these bricks' value, it's perhaps not surprising that when the British colonised India in the 19th century, they see money. The British increased production of indigo and export this blue gold back to the mills of northern England. But the profits come at a huge ethical cost.
When the British came in, they employed people to be landlords, known locally as zamindars. And their job was to ensure that local farmers dedicated at least 15% of their land to the growing of indigo. If any farmer refused to grow indigo, they could actually be fined. So the British Empire and the zamindars are doing very well by this. They're making loads of money. But of course, the farmers are left in poverty.
The conditions under which these farmers work are brutal. And some even say that not a single chest of indigo made its way to Britain without being stained in blood.
The British now have an almost total monopoly on global indigo dye sales. And European demand for blue clothing is at an all-time high. Other nations are looking for an opportunity to break into the market. And ironically, it's a British discovery that shows them the way.
In the mid-1800s, William Henry Perkin is trying to make quinine for the treatment of malaria when the whole thing turns mauve and he invents the first synthetic dye. It's purple, not the coveted blue. But the world sees the potential and the race is on to find a cheaper alternative to natural indigo.
Speed forward to the 1890s, and a German chemist called Carl Humann is working on the problem.
Carl's working for a German company that's investing heavily in finding this elusive blue dye. They come close quite a few times, but the problem is that compared to creating it naturally, the synthetic dyes just aren't quite cheap enough to be competitive.
Carl's working with aniline, a chemical derived from coal tar. The good news is, he's had some success in turning it into indigo.
Unfortunately, it was only a little bit less expensive than making it naturally. They needed something that would really shake this up.
Carl goes on to develop a better method using something called anthranilic acid. The trouble is, the process of making this acid is slow and has low yields.
Enter Eugene Sapper, a colleague of Carl's. Not much is known about this guy. In one history book, he's even referred to as an insignificant worker.
Well, that's a bit of a blow to the ego, isn't it?
But his blunder has a more than significant effect on the company and on the world.
Eugene is there working in his lab at BASF, and he's making some of Carl's recipe for this synthetic indigo.
Now, there are differing accounts as to what happened next.
Some people say that he was trying to measure the temperature. Some people say he needed something to stir it with. But in any case, Eugene reaches for a thermometer and puts it into his mixture as he's making this synthetic indigo. The thermometer breaks.
Now, at this stage, he's probably thinking, oh great, another batch gone. The thing is, this time, something very interesting started to happen.
The mercury from the thermometer reacts with the sulfuric acid in the mixture to form mercury sulfate.
Mercury sulfate, it turns out, is the perfect catalyst for this reaction. That just means that it makes the reaction go much quicker and also gives you more product. It's like you're mixing the ingredients for one cake, but it gives you 4.
Oh, cheers, Greg. Chocolate, my favorite. Can you make another one?
Thanks to Eugene's blunder, synthetic indigo can now be made for a fraction of the cost of natural indigo. Production begins in 1897. Perfect timing, as blue jeans have just been invented.
First pair of jeans was patented by a couple of guys from Bavaria. You might have heard of one of them.
His name was Levi Strauss.
Levi's friend was a tailor called Jacob, and one day a lady approached Jacob with a problem. She wanted him to create the perfect, almost indestructible pair of work trousers. Jacob came up with the idea of introducing rivets into the seams of the jeans to make them virtually indestructible. Hence, the jeans we know today were born.
So these new pants take off.
No, not like that.
They're used by all the people that do hard labor, the cowboys, the miners.
But all that is about to change.
When James Dean famously wears a pair of blue jeans in Rebel Without a Cause, suddenly every teenager in the land needs to have a pair for themselves.
This new invention of the jeans stands the test of time. Here it is 150 years later, and they've yet to go out of style.
I think my jeans feel very boring now. I gotta go get my bedazzler out.
Blue clothes are now everywhere, thanks to the easy access to synthetic dye. But this shift from natural to man-made dye has a huge impact on British-ruled India. 2,700 square miles, an area larger than the entire state of Delaware, is dedicated to growing indigo. But Eugene's new synthetic alternative is driving down demand, and Indian indigo production slumps.
In 1895, Indian exports of natural indigo had totaled nearly 9,500 tons. Just 10 years later, it was little over a quarter of that.
With the demand for indigo dropping so much, the farmers in India are really suffering because they're still beholden to these zamindars to dedicate at least 15% of their land to the growing of indigo. And they're not making any money on this now. And it becomes a full-blown humanitarian crisis.
Unable to pay the rent, many farmers and their families become trapped in a cycle of debt.
And so they revolt.
Now, it's at this time that Gandhi is returning to India from South Africa.
Mahatma Gandhi.
A frail man with an iron-strong moral compass.
He has continued to preach his doctrines of non-violence and passive resistance.
And he receives a letter from an indigo farmer in the Champara region in the northeast part of the country who says, "Can you please help us?"
And that is exactly what Gandhi does. He fights the cause of the indigo farmers.
The British in the region become very nervous because they know that a lot of people listen to Gandhi. So when he gets there, they arrest him for inciting civil disobedience. Well, this enrages the farmers, and they do just that, engage in civil disobedience and start really causing some trouble. After Gandhi is released, he organizes his first satyagraha, which is his method of instilling change through nonviolence.
It was kind of like a ripple effect. And before we knew it, we could see the whole of India uniting to oppose the British rule.
What started out as a disagreement over indigo has exploded. The pressure on the British intensifies to the point that in 1947, India gains its independence. And since then, the country has never looked back.
In the last 50 years, India has completely transformed.
The literacy rate has gone from 34% to 74%.
India now has one of the biggest economies, with millions of people now being pulled out of poverty. It has its own space program, and it's on its way to becoming a global superpower.
So, Eugene Sapper accidentally breaking a thermometer in a German lab sets in motion a chain of events that frees India from the yoke of colonialism.
To think that this all started from someone spilling mercury is utterly mind-blowing.
Still to come, the problem with exploding balls.
This is the Wild Wild West. When one of these balls explodes, everyone pulls out their guns.
And the curse of the killer sausage poison.
This toxin is the most dangerous chemical known to humankind.
But before that... Did you know that there have been courts of law for over 4,000 years? But for most of that time, convicting a criminal involved more courtroom drama than solid evidence.
A few hundred years ago, forensic science wasn't even a science. I mean, people would find a body by a river and just assume that they had drowned. Even if they found a mark on the head, they might just say, well, maybe they bumped their head on a rock or something. You really didn't have the idea of processing evidence in a seriously analytic way that would allow you to make serious conclusions about a case.
1 minute. His eyes were a little like that. He had a patch over one eye when he come into my dive.
Well, the guy that stuck me up had on horn-rimmed glasses.
He was wearing a Band-Aid across his nose when he knocked me over.
One of the first major developments in the world of forensic science is fingerprint matching.
When we look at our hands, we have these fingerprints, we have these lines. But not many people realize that these were unique to individuals.
It isn't until the 1870s that the potential of fingerprints as a crime-fighting tool occurs to anyone. And that person is a Scottish doctor called Henry Folds, who's on a medical mission in Japan.
One day he decides to go on an archaeological dig with his friend. Whilst he's on the dig, they discover this beautiful bit of pottery.
He noticed on one of the clay pots a well-preserved fingerprint. And he got really intrigued by this.
Henry gets so inspired by that pottery with the fingerprints that he starts to play with some ink. And he actually takes fingerprints of all his colleagues and himself just to see the different variations.
What fascinates Henry is how each person's fingerprint is totally unique.
So he's analyzing each one and sort of looking at the differences. Can't imagine being one of the first people to really start to look at this scientifically.
Fingerprints are formed in the womb as the embryo's hands touch their surroundings, causing friction ridges. So even in identical twins, prints will be different, and these patterns remain the same throughout our lives. Henry Fold's collection of prints comes in handy almost immediately when there's a theft at work.
When a bottle of alcohol went missing from the hospital, some people accused Fold's friend of taking it.
This is most unusual.
He finds a fingerprint on one of the beakers and is able to prove that it wasn't his friend. So his friend gets off the hook, and they end up identifying who the criminal is by his fingerprint.
After Fold's initial success, he's convinced that fingerprints are a useful crime-fighting tool, and he offers his new insights to Scotland Yard, who completely ignore them. It isn't until 2 years later, when a civil servant working in India introduces the idea again, that it finally takes off.
Charles Darwin's cousin actually did quite a lot of research on this and found that the chance of getting it wrong is like 1 in 64 billion.
Given that there's fewer than 8 billion people alive today, that's pretty good odds.
It remained one of the best technologies for identification for 100 years.
But what happens when a crime scene has no fingerprints? Fast forward to 1984. Ronald Reagan's in the White House, Gorbachev's about to become Soviet leader, and Cabbage Patch dolls are flying off the shelves everywhere. In England, Alec Jeffreys is experimenting with a molecule that's now a household name, but wasn't well known at the time: deoxyribonucleic acid, aka DNA.
At this time, very little is known about just how much information you can get from DNA.
Most research at the time was into how DNA stores information. But Jeffreys is more interested in how it differs between relatives.
So he takes DNA from his technician, that technician's parents, a monkey, a cow, and a plant.
If this sounds like some horrific Frankenstein experiment, it isn't.
He wants to compare DNA. But DNA is not visible to the naked eye, so he puts radioactive probes on it and then puts that material on a photographic plate and leaves it there to see what it will reveal.
Quite frankly, I never expected it would work in a million years.
Well, that's not very hopeful. But when he returns after the weekend to develop the plates,
he sees all these splotches and he's like, oh no, I've messed it up.
It looks like his experiment is a disaster. But a few minutes later, the penny drops.
He realizes that actually there are patterns in there. And what he can surmise is that the plant's DNA is quite different from those of the animals. But most importantly, the technician's DNA is quite similar to those of her parents. And as a matter of fact, he can see that it's a combination.
Quite unexpectedly, the image clearly shows that not only does the DNA of each species have its own particular pattern, but so does each person. And it's unique, like a personal barcode.
Obvious then that this wasn't just a matter of individual identification made possible with these patterns, but also establishing family relationships. And I think having seen that, I mean, everything then happened very, very quickly.
And it was that sort of eureka moment that he realized just how significant and unique everybody's DNA was.
Alec Jeffreys had discovered how to produce simple patterns of the genetic material DNA as characteristic and invariable as fingerprints.
And It's been hidden inside every cell in our bodies since the beginning of time. You're probably wondering, how does it work?
Elementary, my dear Watson.
Well, it's really not. It's actually quite complicated, but I love your enthusiasm.
DNA is only composed of 4 subunits, and we give these subunits letters to name them, G, C, A, and T. Now, the order in which these appear are what make your genes unique. This is like letters in words that then compose a whole book. You're only using a limited number of letters, but the possibilities are endless.
So DNA is responsible for making different proteins, which then make up different genes, which will identify, say, someone's characteristics: brown hair, blonde hair, blue eyes, brown eyes, etc. Then there's other parts of the DNA that were thought once as being junk DNA, but turns out they're actually very useful in identifying humans.
These junk areas differ hugely between individuals.
So mine might be very different than yours. So you can have often very repeating patterns like GCA, 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 and it just keeps on going. And I might have 10 of those in a row, whereas someone else might have 30.
By comparing these repeating patterns in the junk DNA, scientists can determine whose belongs to who with startling accuracy.
The chance of any 2 people having the exact same DNA is astronomically small.
1 in 575 trillion.
And there's only been around 107 billion people that have ever lived. So your DNA won't just not match anyone's alive now, it won't match anyone's ever.
One night over dinner, Alec and his wife Susan were discussing his discoveries.
I would have loved to be a fly on the wall in that conversation.
Honey, I'm home. I've just invented DNA fingerprinting.
It was then that Susan made an interesting point. What if DNA fingerprinting could help resolve immigration cases, and especially those family disputes?
Sure enough, the following March, Alec has his first chance to put his new discovery to the test. A young boy called Andrew has been stopped coming into Britain.
Now, he's a British citizen, and his mother is standing right next to him. But Andrew refers to his mother as auntie, which in their culture is normal. However, border control think that his passport is fake, and they want to deport him back to Ghana.
Alec ends up comparing the DNA fingerprint of Andrew, his mom, and of his siblings.
And I think you can immediately see the first band or genetic character in Andrew. This clearly comes from his mother. Here's another character which comes from his mother.
The son is who he says he is, who the family says he is, and it's a smashing success.
So this ends up all over the news, the newspapers, the media. Everyone is so excited about this newfound way of identifying ourselves.
I think it was just the look on that woman's face that, more than anything else, gave me enormous satisfaction.
And it wasn't long before police came knocking on his door asking for help in resolving some crimes.
There's a horrific case where a schoolgirl has been murdered. It's believed to be linked to another death 3 years previously. The police are confident that they have their killer and want Alec to prove his guilt.
Their suspect is a 17-year-old boy who has a learning disability, and they for sure think that it's him. So they gather all the data and send it over to Alec.
Jeffries and his team were given samples taken from both crime scenes. The entire case would rest on this groundbreaking work.
The police are right, and the DNA samples taken from the 2 murder scenes do match. But Jeffrey's test proves these crimes weren't committed by the teenage suspect. His DNA fingerprint is completely different.
The police didn't believe it. They actually asked for these tests to be run several times, and each time it came up negative for him. The evidence doesn't lie here.
The teenage boy is the first person in history to be exonerated by DNA. In the 35 years since its discovery, DNA fingerprinting has been used in many surprising ways.
It can authenticate caviar, fine wine.
It's even used in wildlife forensics, where we can see if certain materials are taken from illegal or unreputable sources.
One use of DNA fingerprinting that Jeffries couldn't have foreseen is to clean up a London borough, not of crime, but of dog poop.
There's literally facilities where you have to send in the DNA of your pet to them so that if you end up not cleaning up after your dog, they can identify who you are.
In the UK, they've got a mandate to microchip, and so adding DNA registration to that requirement that's already in motion is a natural next step.
In motion. You have a way with words, sir. And it doesn't take a brain the size of Alex's to work out where this is being done.
So something that was totally an accident ended up impacting every single one of our lives. This is so important for not just our immediate future, but our long-term future as we evolve more as a species.
Coming up, does poison make camels more attractive?
I don't know. I'm not an expert on camel beauty. I'll leave it for you to decide.
But first, this. We now live in a plastic age. But did you know that this adaptable material was discovered by accident? The story starts back in the 1860s. Michael Phelan is a superstar, a professional billiards player, and a passionate promoter of the game. But he's also a man with a problem. He needs to find a new material for his balls.
He doesn't like what's going on with this slaughter of elephants. So he offers a prize for anyone who can come up with a replacement for the ivory billiard balls of $10,000.
Which is $250,000 in today's money.
That's a lot.
Hang on. Just go back a bit. What did you say these balls were made of?
Ivory. And that's made from elephant tusks. And these are pretty much just giant overgrown teeth. And when I say giant, I mean giant. They can be as big as 80 kilograms, which translates to 176 pounds. That's as heavy as a full-grown kangaroo.
But as we all know, there's nothing in nature that's truly perfect. Nope, not even you.
Because ivory is essentially an animal product, each ball is slightly different consistency.
Another issue with using an elephant tusk is just like the human tooth has a channel with nerves and pulp, so do the tusks. Now, when they formed a billiard ball, they would have a channel through them, so they would fill it with ebony wood. And that's why certain billiard balls have that little spot on it. That's where it came from.
Nowadays, it's hard to imagine quite how popular billiards was at the time. This is during the Civil War, and yet the game receives more press coverage than some of the battles. It's one of the most popular amusements in the Western world. Chicago alone has 830 pool halls. But all those pool tables need balls, and the elephant population is dwindling.
Each elephant tusk makes about 3 to 5 billiard balls. So just to service the British market, something like 12,000 elephants are being slaughtered every year. Then add to that the American market, the European market. This is a species that's just being wiped out.
The world's largest land animal is heading towards extinction. A new material is needed.
Finding a replacement for the ivory meant that you had to find something that was similar in properties. In particular, it needs to have the same density. So that way, when it's the exact same size, it'll have the same weight. The average billiard ball at the time was around 7 ounces, which is about the weight of a hamster.
Why do you keep measuring things in animals? Anyway, remember our billiard superstar Michael Phelan? Well, in 1863, he puts an advert in the papers offering a handsome fortune to anyone who can come up with a suitable replacement for ivory balls.
So there's a chap called John Hyatt. He's a printer. He's not even a chemist or a scientist of any description, but he sees the announcement with the big reward attached and thinks, maybe I can come up with a solution to this.
John tries experimenting by gluing paper and sawdust together. It's not hugely successful. And one day he manages to cut himself.
he goes to the cabinet and he gets this antiseptic called colloidine. It's used at the time, but not now. While he's treating his cut finger, he accidentally spills the colloidine. And it's a big mess.
Everything seems to be going wrong for poor old John until he notices that the antiseptic has hardened. Now, why is that? Well, collodion is essentially cellulose nitrate mixed with ether and alcohol to turn it into a liquid. But when the ether and alcohol evaporate, it just leaves that hardened substance.
This is his eureka moment. He realizes that he has discovered, through a series of accidents, a new material.
This material could hold the key to the billiard ball problem.
Hyatt's new material has potential, but he finds that it can't really be shaped. And without that, it's pretty useless.
Driven by the huge prize money, John is spurred on to keep investigating. He spends 7 years experimenting and working out what may modify this material to make it moldable.
John throws everything into this project. What he's looking for is something that he can add to this hardened material that would allow him to shape it into a billiard ball. And eventually, he comes across camphor from the camphor tree.
Camphor is an ingredient used in ointments and mothballs. No wonder his search took so long. Luckily, he didn't mothball the entire project. Anyway, camphor allows the cellulose nitrate molecules to be separated.
Just think of spaghetti that's cooled off. They kind of all stick together and clump together. But if you add oil, then they can like slide around and the spaghetti loosens.
The camphor breaks down some of the linkages in the cellulose nitrate, turning it from a quite hard resin into a material that can be molded and shaped. Adding some heat and pressure, he's able to create the perfect size, perfect weighted billiard ball. He calls this material celluloid, which is the granddaddy of all plastics that we know today.
But while celluloid solves the ivory shortage and probably helps save the elephants, it isn't perfect.
Unfortunately, when the new balls hit each other,
which is kind of the point of the game,
every so often there's an explosion.
The nature of this cellulose nitrate is similar to that of TNT, where the N stands for nitrate. These nitrates were very flammable and unstable, and so you get this exothermic reaction when they collided.
Unsurprisingly, this quirky habit of exploding balls put a few people on edge.
One day, John receives a letter from a guy who owns a billiard saloon in Colorado. There's a little problem with these balls exploding. No, it's not the explosion of the balls themselves, but this is the Wild Wild West. When one of these balls explodes, everyone pulls out their guns. And next thing you know, you're in a standoff.
This problem is eventually solved 37 years later in 1907 with the invention of the resin balls we still use today. History isn't clear whether John ever receives his reward, but it doesn't really matter. He's just created the first commercial plastic.
The accidental discovery of this celluloid plastic was totally mind-blowing for manufacturing. It really opened up new opportunities for creating all kinds of products.
Combs, jewellery, hand mirrors, knife handles, ornaments, collars, cuffs, dice, toys.
Cast in lead molds and converted into consumer products by machining.
Celluloid is a polymer, the first ever manufactured, and its impact is immeasurable. Many scientists can see its huge potential and begin tweaking the recipe.
Polymers are really long molecules that are made up of a repeating unit, a little bit like the links in a chain. These can be modified chemically to be softer or harder, stronger or lighter, depending on what you need to use them for.
These properties are what makes this wonder material so useful for so many things, filling the world around us.
Plastics are everywhere. Let's take a typical day. You wake up, you unplug your phone from its charger. You get up, you squeeze your toothpaste out of the tube. You brush your teeth.
Yeah, I think we get the picture.
Get home, you cook dinner.
Oh, she's still going.
You go to bed, you turn your light off. So much plastic. All day, every day.
Nowadays, there's even stealthy plastics that you don't even know are there. They're in sponges, chewing gum, baby wipes, coffee cups. I mean, they're ubiquitous, they're everywhere.
Plastics have not just entered our homes, they've also revolutionized the medical world.
It's created heart valves that are safe to use, prosthetics that fit exactly, and even things like gloves and syringes used by doctors and nurses are all made of plastic.
Ignition. Liftoff.
Plastics are so versatile and flexible, they've enabled mankind to venture into space.
We have a liftoff. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
In fact, without plastics, Neil Armstrong wouldn't have been able to set foot on the moon.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
They're incorporated into the visors of their helmets and other parts of their helmets. Their spacesuits have tubing throughout it to keep them at a safe temperature. So plastics are literally above our heads, orbiting the Earth.
One of the reasons that plastics are so brilliant is that they're incredibly durable and virtually indestructible. But that's also their downfall.
Plastics are so hard to break down, it is thought that any plastic that's ever been made still persists to this day.
It's been estimated that up to 2015, we've made something like 9 billion tons of plastics.
I mean, it's just such an awful concept because it's gonna stick around, you know, in the soil, in the oceans, in the landfill. It's not going away.
But that's okay, because we'll just recycle it, right? Because they've got those little arrows on the triangle in the bottom, right?
Actually, in reality, the process is complicated, it's really expensive, the end product is inferior, and in fact, it just doesn't happen. 91% of plastic isn't recycled. So the cruel irony is that we've barely saved the elephants, and the wondrous substance that was created in order to do that, though, is basically destroying the planet.
But there is hope. Researchers are working furiously to come up with a solution to tackle the plastic problem.
Thankfully, science is always coming up with innovative solutions. And in 2017, some Pakistani scientists found a mushroom that's actually able to break down plastics.
And since then, it seems there are about 50 types of mushrooms that have a craving for plastic.
So here we are today. We have this super invention that transforms our lives. There may be a big problem with it, but now, through innovation, we now have solutions for mitigating that problem. We're not there yet. We still have a long way to go, but I'm confident that we'll get there.
This story begins with sausages.
Yummy.
German sausages.
Do you mean wieners?
That's right. It's the late 18th century, and we're in the southwestern kingdom of Württemberg.
Imagine the scene. Beauty spots, powdered wigs.
But there's a strange affliction stalking the land that's slowly killing people. And it seems to be connected with their diet.
Now, you don't normally associate sausages with difficulties in breathing and swallowing, double vision and death. But that's exactly what's happening. These sausages are more Frankenstein than Frankfurter.
Into the picture steps the region's chief medical officer, Justinus Kerner.
Kerner comes and starts looking at these people and realizes that, unlike other poisonings, it is a problem of muscle control, in that their muscles stop working.
Kerner manages to identify the toxin that's causing this paralysis. He names it botulus, after the Latin word for sausage. But the more he studies it, the more he wonders.
Dr. Kerner's mind works a little bit differently to you and me. We'd be thinking, oh my God, avoid those sausages. But he's thinking, that's interesting. Maybe there's something in the sausages that could be made to work to our benefit.
For years, Kerner searches for a medical use for this poison, but it's in vain. It's another 7 decades before the bacteria that produces the neurotoxin is properly identified.
It was Clostridium botulinum, which makes the most deadly toxin known to humans.
So it turns out that this bacteria survives and actually thrives within soil, which is where a lot of our food grows.
But it needs a lack of oxygen to do its deadly work.
Here's one example.
If the bacterium gets in something like a tin can, it's got plenty of nutrients to eat, and of course it's anaerobic, and these are the perfect conditions for it. I remember my grandmother telling me whenever she would open a can, she would check to see if it had bulged, and she would tap it to hear if it had a hollow sound. And it's because when she grew up, it wasn't terribly uncommon to hear of somebody getting botulism poisoning from canned food.
Create appetizing new dishes.
If you are unlucky enough to eat tainted food, it's bad news, because the botulism toxin attacks the nerves and muscles, stopping them from working properly.
Now, we have about 600 muscles in our body, and many of these rely on signals from our brain sending messages down and talking to the muscles at the neuromuscular junction. And if you interfere with these molecules drifting over and landing on the muscle won't know that it's supposed to become active.
If the muscle can't contract, it causes paralysis.
And if enough toxin gets into your body, it can cause bigger muscle groups to also become paralyzed, such as the lungs. And this inevitably can be fatal.
The toxin is so deadly that less than a microgram can kill a human adult. That's a millionth of a gram.
Just 1 kilogram.
Kilogram. See what you did there, Suze?
Which is about the size of this bag of sugar, could kill every human on the planet. This toxin is the most dangerous chemical known to humankind.
So perhaps it should be no surprise that armies try out botulism as a biological weapon.
There were some crazy ideas in World War II, and the Americans came up with a real humdinger. And this was to get Chinese prostitutes to have tiny, tiny, tiny capsules of this toxin in their hairpins, which they then administer into drinks and serve up to Japanese army clients, thereby bumping off Japanese officers.
And given the high rates of botulism in the area at the time, it was the perfect crime.
It sounds like a foolproof plan. But before they can put it into action, they hit a problem.
So some batches of the toxin were sent over to the US Navy just off the shore of China, and they tested it out on stray donkeys. Now, the donkeys refused to die. In fact, they showed no signs of damage whatsoever.
And because the donkeys survive, the operation is abandoned. It isn't until much later on that a critical bit of information comes to light.
It is thought that donkeys may be one of the few animals that are immune to botulism.
What a pain in the ass! Or not. Fast forward to 1977. 2 American researchers are experimenting with medical uses for botulism. They paralyze the face muscles of a cross-eyed chimp with an injection of the poison, and it cures him. Finally confirming Kerner's hunch that there was something to be gained from the killer sausage toxin.
It took about 150 years, but the assumptions from Justinus turned out to be right.
A decade later, botulism is approved for medical use on humans.
So eye spasms is a really debilitating condition. And it affects about 4% of Americans, so that's more than the population of New York.
Scale that up to worldwide, and the number of people who can be cured probably stretches into the hundreds of millions.
Now that we have a cure that can alleviate a lot of those symptoms, this is a really big deal for a lot of people.
One of the people administering this new technique to stop muscle spasms and misalignment in the eye is Jean Carruthers, based in Vancouver.
She's the last of the Jeans in this show, I promise.
Jean is using teeny tiny amounts of this toxin to stop the muscles around the eye from spasming or misaligning.
So Jean's treating people who have blepharospasm. That's a kind of involuntary spasm of the eyelids. And you know, it can be so bad that people are basically effectively blind. I mean, they even have to be led in by their partners into the surgery. It's something incredibly life-compromising.
One day she's treating a patient who points out that she hasn't had the middle of her forehead injected.
She said, "You didn't treat me here. I know I'm not spasming there, but every time you treat me there, I get this beautiful, untroubled expression."
This chance exchange leads Jean to a bright new idea that will go on to change the face of Hollywood. Literally.
Now, by a happy coincidence, Jean's husband just so happens to be a dermatologist, and he's treating people who complain about having deep frown lines that are prematurely aging them. And he's using a traditional method, fillers, which is pretty ugly, painful, and ultimately doesn't work that well.
Jean thinks that her muscle paralysis toxin could be the solution her husband has been looking for.
So she needs to test this theory on somebody, and she is one of the first that she gets to do this on. She injects herself.
Just as Jean suspected, the botulinum toxin paralyzes the wrinkles away.
So what happens when you smile or you frown? You have a contracting and a releasing of the muscles in your face. That's just how it moves naturally.
Now the problem is, over time, as we start to age, these creases become a little bit more pronounced. By using this botulism, you paralyze those muscles and you can't form those creases. And without those creases, you don't get any wrinkles.
In 2001, a name for this treatment is registered as a trademark.
Botox?
No, it's absolutely true.
Botox really gained popularity in the early 2000s when personalities in reality shows like The Real Housewives regularly received Botox injections on camera.
Botox is now the most popular cosmetic procedure across the world. You'd be hard-pressed to find somebody in Hollywood that hasn't had a treatment.
It's so popular that in 2019, more than 6 million people got Botox around the world. That's a lot of needles.
By 2027, the global industry is set to be worth $7.7 billion. But it's not just cosmetics that's benefited from the taming of botulism.
Botox can actually be used for treating a lot of different medical conditions.
Anything from preventing sweaty palms to reducing painful muscle spasms for those with cerebral palsy, and even to reduce migraines.
Migraines are a horrible condition to suffer from, and I've seen it in my own personal life since my wife suffers from them on an almost daily basis. And it impacts roughly 1 in 8 people in the United States today. Sufferers are forced to either miss work or just leave their careers altogether. That costs the U.S. economy a lot of money. We're talking about billions of dollars each year.
There's even research to suggest that Botox may help alleviate an illness that affects 264 million people worldwide.
Depression is something, it's like a personal prison. It's something that, it's like being in a cell that you can't get out of. People often don't understand the torment that people are going through. They can't meet friends, they can't go to work, they feel anxious. So the current treatments for that are things like psychotherapy and mood-boosting drugs. Now, for some people, that might offer a bit of respite, but for a lot of people, it just doesn't work.
Now, nobody set out to do a clinical study on Botox and depression, but they realized with enough people getting this treatment that they had the data right there to look at. So a group looked at 40,000 people who had undergone Botox treatment.
People that had received Botox reported an up to 88% reduction in the symptoms of depression, which when you think about it is incredible.
Happiness starts with a smile.
A clue to what's happening here can be found in the smile experiments of the 1970s.
Just put one on and your troubles will be gone, 'cause happiness starts with a smile.
What they found was that basically, if you smile a lot more, believe it or not, you're also happier. And with Botox, well, basically, you're prevented from frowning.
Just take that frown and turn it
It's
around.
almost like Botox that makes people more beautiful on the outside, also makes them feel more beautiful on the inside.
Somebody says, "Oh, Dolly, you always just look so happy." I said, "That's the Botox."
A few years ago, the Botox story took another strange turn, when its cosmetic properties began being used outside the human race.
Now, you're not going to believe this, but in Saudi Arabia, every year, there is a beauty contest for camels, and it's big, big money.
And in 2018, there were a few camels that actually got disqualified for having Botox done.
Apparently, Botox makes a camel more beautiful. I don't know. I'm not an expert on camel beauty. I'll leave it for you to decide.
So it's thanks to deadly sausages, cross-eyed chimps, and a chance encounter in a Canadian doctor's office that we have such young-looking camels nowadays. Is that the lesson here?